Welcome to the Severe Media Network. This video is about the ADOS movement. If you like the commentary, don't forget to click the button below, comment, subscribe, and share with friends. The movement for the descendants of slaves did not begin with the hashtag ADOS. Many people, including myself, have used the term descendants of slaves and was calling for the reparations for the black descendants of the blood relatives that experienced slavery in America. Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore did not create the idea of the descendants of slaves. They did create the current national dialogue for the movement, and they deserve credit and recognition for that. But the movement has its flaws. No movement is perfect, but the ADOS movement has some very good arguments. I do not claim to be fully aware of everything that they have done or profess, but I did recognize some vices and virtues that I will point out briefly in this video. One of the things that I see that is retrogressive is the harsh criticism of other descendants of slaves in public, on video, and online. I am not specifically talking about Mr. Moore or Ms. Carnell. I am referring to the entire DOS population. When there is a legitimate issue and facts are being distorted, it is appropriate to correct them, but the name calling has to stop. We must represent ourselves with a higher level of integrity despite the internal or external forces against us. 2. Stop differentiating descendants of slaves from mixed breeds, quote unquote. It is not only offensive to our legitimate brothers and sisters, but the DOS population are all a mixed breed of many different races, most often African, European, and Native American. So if a person has one parent that is a DOS and they identify as DOS, we have no right to make them feel illegitimate. They are descendants of slaves because they have blood of a DOS. 3. The technical description should be African American descendants of slaves. We should never isolate ourselves from our homeland, even though we want to define that our ancestors were specifically held as slaves in the United States of America. 4. We can use the acronym AADOS for now, but eventually we have to evolve to the United States of African Americans. While our ancestors endured the slave culture, we are not defined by that experience alone. We are much more than a period in history where our people suffered through the worst crime against humanity. The American descendants of slaves' position on immigrants is a legitimate one. Although we do not hate immigrants, it is important for the immigrant population to understand that they have been working against us and not in accordance with us. They have not been allies to the African Americans, although we have historically welcomed them into our communities and fought for immigrant rights, even though it was not in our best interest economically. The history of immigration started when wealthy white business and landowners wanted to deprive African Americans the ability to evolve economically through the workforce. The white businessmen and women were dependent on the black labor force. Their enmity for the descendants of slaves caused them to decide to import other poor workers of many different races and ethnicities into the country to replace descendants of slaves in the workforce. This was a ploy to keep blacks in poverty, prevent black laborers from unionizing, and keep wages low for the working class and high profit margins for business owners. The immigrant was specifically brought here to replace African Americans and to compete with African American labor class. The problem African Americans have with immigrants now is most immigrants come to America for a better life. But African Americans were here as slaves and built the country from its inception. The wealth of the United States rests solely on the slave culture practiced here since 1619. So African Americans have the right to be angry when immigrants come into this country and adopt the traditions of benign neglect when it comes to African American issues. Many immigrants benefit from the Civil Rights Act that African Americans have fought and died for. This meant terrorism, lynchings, and hangings, amongst other penalties for protesting. But while many immigrants use the terms civil rights and human rights, they do not stand in solidarity with African Americans who are still fighting for the rights not to be shot down in the street by the police force or discriminated against for economic liberation. The vast majority of immigrants adopt a position against the African American people, using traditional talking points created by the racist white population like black people are lazy, black people are criminal, black people don't want these jobs anyway, quote unquote. Immigrants do not come to America to be an ally with black people, although they want to benefit from the human rights that blacks initiated and the economic surplus from the tradition of slavery. Immigrants come into the United States and they receive benefits that African Americans are deprived from systematically. Many get grants and loans to open up businesses in predominantly African American neighborhoods, and they suck the wealth out of the community. It is not the individual immigrant's fault. They are simply doing business. But African Americans understand that it is a facet of the racist system that has been against the economic progress of African Americans since the country was founded. Being the humanists that we are, African Americans patronize immigrant businesses and treated all immigrants, Puerto Rican, African, Asian, and Mexican, etc., like kin. We fought for immigrant rights and called them brother and sister. But when we were rallying because our young and old men were being shot down in the streets, immigrants separated themselves from us for social and political gain. Our lives did not matter to the immigrant population. They set out. They did not lock arms with us to fight for our humanity and our right to live. So immigrants should understand why some African Americans are separating themselves from immigrant issues now. It is just time that we reciprocate and do things only for our own group interest. We will not patronize your establishments. We have become keenly aware that immigrants do not patronize black businesses or partner with black businessmen and women. You never see Mexicans or Asians in a soul food restaurant. No, they support their own people, and it's time that we did the same. As it concerns reparations for slavery, a lot of immigrants, especially European immigrants that arrived after the slavery phenomena in America, argue that their family did not participate in the slave culture in the United States, so they should not be responsible for repairing the descendants of slaves. Wrong! You cannot choose the United States for all of its benefits and none of its debt. Let's talk about this. Leave your comments at the bottom of the screen and share this video with friends and family. How do you feel about the ADOS movement and the issues with immigration? This is a Severe Media Network signing off. Have a blessed and productive day. Peace.